What if I told you that 3 teenagers vanished from a place everyone trusted, leaving behind nothing but neatly folded clothes and questions that would haunt an entire community for more than 2 decades? What if the answer was hiding in plain sight the entire time, concealed beneath the very structure where they were last seen alive? This is the story of Michael Alen, Beth Renfro, and Tess Jenson, 3 young lives that disappeared into darkness on an ordinary summer night in 1986, and the truth that remained buried beneath cold water and deliberate silence until technology finally caught up with deception. Before we dive into one of the most disturbing cases of concealment you'll ever hear, I need 3 things from you. First, hit that like button right now. It tells the algorithm that stories like this matter, that families who waited decades for answers deserve to have their stories heard. Second, drop a comment below telling me what you think happened here, because this case has layers that will make you question everything you thought you knew about small-town safety. And third, subscribe to 72-Hour True Crime and turn on those notifications, because every single week we're bringing you cases that refuse to be solved quickly, cases that demanded years of persistence, cases where the truth fought back against time itself. Now let's get into what really happened in rural Colorado during the summer that changed everything. The summer of 1986 settled over rural Colorado like any other season people would remember, as uncomplicated. The days stretched long and lazy, the kind where heat built slowly and broke gently as evening arrived. The nights were cool enough to keep windows open, to let the sound of crickets drift through bedrooms, to make sleeping easy and untroubled. The towns scattered across this landscape were small enough that everyone recognized every passing truck by the sound of its engine, knew which families drove which vehicles, could tell you who was headed where just by watching the dust trail on gravel roads. Nothing about that summer suggested it would end in silence. Nothing warned the people living there that one ordinary weekend would fracture the sense of safety they had trusted for generations, would create a mystery so complete that it would take 22 years and technological advancement to finally understand what had been hidden right beneath their feet. The community sat miles away from anything resembling a city, the kind of distance that made people self-reliant and close-knit simultaneously. Gravel roads cut through stretches of open land broken by farmhouses that had stood for generations, tree lines that marked property boundaries, and long fences that separated cattle from crops and neighbors from each other in the polite way rural people maintained privacy. Teenagers grew up fast there, not because life was particularly hard or demanding, but because independence came early and naturally. Parents worked long hours on farms and in small businesses that required constant attention. Kids learned which roads to avoid during spring flooding, which neighbors could be trusted with a broken-down vehicle or a family emergency, and where to go when they needed space to think or talk or simply exist without adult supervision. Freedom was normal, expected, even encouraged within reasonable boundaries. Danger felt distant, something that happened in cities, something you read about in newspapers or saw on television news broadcasts that covered places far removed from this quiet corner of Colorado. Michael Alen had grown up exactly that way, 17 years old that summer, tall for his age, quiet without being withdrawn or antisocial. He wasn't reckless, the kind of teenager who sought out trouble or pushed limits just to see what would happen. He wasn't a troublemaker in any sense that concerned his parents, or teachers, or the few law enforcement officers who patrolled the county. Teachers described him as steady, reliable, the kind of student who showed up on time, completed assignments without drama, and helped others when asked. Friends said he listened more than he spoke, that he thought before he answered questions, that he had a calm presence that made him easy to be around. He spent most of his time helping his father with small repairs around their property, learning practical skills that would serve him well in a rural environment where knowing how to fix things yourself was more valuable than knowing how to hire someone else to do it. He worked part-time jobs that paid cash and built responsibility, the kind of work that taught him about showing up consistently and earning trust. Michael wasn't the kind of teenager people worried about. If anything, people worried he took life too seriously for his age, that he didn't cut loose enough, that he carried himself with a maturity that seemed beyond his years. Beth Renfro was different in energy, but similar in the fundamental trustworthiness that made parents feel comfortable when their children spent time with her. She was outspoken in the way confident young women can be when they've been raised to believe their opinions matter, observant in ways that made her notice details others missed, and practical in her approach to problems and challenges. She had grown up in the same area, surrounded by extended family, cousins and aunts and uncles who lived within a few miles of each other, creating a support network that meant someone always knew where everyone else was most of the time. Beth had plans beyond the town, ambitions that didn't diminish where she came from but acknowledged she wanted to experience more. College brochures sat folded in her room, tucked into notebooks she never left behind, marked with notes about programs that interested her, and deadlines she needed to meet. She talked about leaving, about studying in a city, about seeing what existed beyond the boundaries of rural Colorado. But she never talked about running away, never expressed the kind of desperate need to escape that worried parents. She was planning for a future, not fleeing from a present. Tess Jenson was the youngest of the three, just 16 that summer, and still balanced between childhood and adulthood in ways that were sometimes awkward and sometimes charming. She laughed easily, the kind of genuine laughter that came from finding joy in small moments rather than forced humor. She stayed close to Beth, looked up to her, valued the friendship in ways that made her feel more mature by association. She followed Michael's lead without question, trusted his judgment, felt safer when he was part of whatever they were doing. People described her as cautious, but curious, someone who wanted to experience things but didn't rush into situations without thinking them through first. She liked late-night conversations, the kind where teenagers talked about everything and nothing, where secrets were shared and dreams were discussed and fears were admitted. She appreciated quiet moments, places that felt familiar, environments where she didn't have to perform or pretend to be anything other than herself. Tess didn't push boundaries aggressively. She stepped carefully around them, testing them gently, respecting them when they proved solid. The three of them had known each other for years, their lives intersecting in the ways small-town lives naturally do. They weren't inseparable, didn't spend every waking moment together, didn't define themselves primarily by their friendship. There was no dramatic intensity to their connection, no exclusive bond that shut others out. They were just connected in the way teenagers are in small towns where social circles overlap naturally, where you've known the same people since elementary school, where everyone has multiple friendship groups that shift and reconfigure depending on activities and interests and circumstances. They shared classes in the small high school, sat together sometimes at lunch, participated in some of the same activities. Friends knew they got along, that they enjoyed each other's company, that spending time together was comfortable and easy rather than complicated or dramatic. On weekends during the summer, they often gathered near the water where a narrow lake sat tucked between tree lines and farmland, the kind of natural feature that became a central gathering point for young people in rural areas where entertainment options were limited and outdoor spaces were abundant. It wasn't public property in any official sense, no signs announced it as a park or recreation area, no fees were charged for access. But no one ever enforced that distinction, no landowner ever complained about teenagers using the space, and over the years it had simply become accepted as a place where people could go. The dock had been there longer than anyone could remember, one of those structures that becomes part of the landscape so thoroughly that people stop thinking about when or how it was built. Old wood reinforced over the years as boards warped or rotted, repaired when cracks became dangerous, repainted when splinters multiplied. It was part of the geography, accepted without question, used without permission because permission had never been required. The dock wasn't hidden away in some secret location that required insider knowledge to find. It wasn't dangerous in any way that concerned parents, or prompted warnings. It was simply a place where kids fished during the day, where couples sat at night looking at stars, where people cooled off when summer heat pressed too hard and the water offered relief. Adults knew about it because they had gone there when they were young, had their own memories associated with that dock and that lake. There was no reputation for trouble, no history of serious accidents, no reason to treat it as anything other than what it appeared to be, a safe, familiar place where generations of young people had gathered. It was safe because it had always been safe, trusted because trust had never been violated, ordinary because nothing extraordinary had ever happened there. Until the night that changed everything. That Friday night in late summer passed like so many others had passed before it, unremarkable in every way that would later seem significant only in retrospect. Families ate dinner around tables, conversations flowing in the comfortable patterns of people who knew each other well. Televisions flickered in living rooms, broadcasting shows that would be forgotten as soon as they ended, providing background noise and distraction. Porch lights came on as the sky darkened, insects gathering around the bulbs, creating small ecosystems of light and shadow. Michael finished his evening at home without argument, no conflict with his parents, no tension that suggested anything was wrong. He was calm, normal, present in the way he always was. Beth spoke with her mother before stepping out, a brief conversation that covered where she was going and when she expected to be back, the kind of check-in that responsible teenagers did without resentment. Tess told her parents she was meeting friends, received the usual reminders about being safe and not staying out too late, nodded in agreement the way she always did. Nothing was unusual that night. Nothing felt secretive or hidden. None of them packed bags as if they were planning to be gone for days. None of them brought alcohol or substances that might impair judgment or create problems. None of them acted like they were preparing for anything other than a short break from the heat, a few hours of relief from the temperature that had been building all day, time spent with friends doing exactly what they'd done countless times before. There was no dramatic goodbye, no final conversation that would later be remembered as significant, no moment that felt like an ending. It was just a normal Friday night in a small Colorado town where teenagers had freedom and parents had trust, and nothing suggested that trust was about to be shattered completely. Sometime after midnight, when most of the town was asleep and roads were empty of traffic, the three met up and drove toward the lake. The exact time was never established with precision, no one recorded their departure or noted when vehicles passed, but witnesses and family members placed it in that window after midnight when the world was quiet and dark. The road there was familiar enough to navigate without thought, without needing to concentrate or second-guess turns. They'd driven it dozens of times, maybe hundreds, enough that it was automatic, the kind of route you could follow while having a conversation without losing track of where you were going. They parked close to the water in a spot that had been used countless times before by them and by others, a place where the ground was packed down from repeated use, where vehicles could pull off the road safely. No neighbors reported shouting that night, no sounds of argument or conflict. No one heard laughter echoing through the trees, the kind of noise that teenagers sometimes make when they're enjoying themselves without concern for who might be disturbed. The night swallowed sound the way it always did in rural areas, where distances between homes meant noise didn't travel far, where silence was the default state and any disturbance was noteworthy enough to remember. The absence of sound would later seem significant, would raise questions about what actually happened in those dark hours, would suggest that whatever occurred happened quietly, quickly, without the chaos that people expected from tragedy. What happened next, investigators would later say, should have left traces that told a clear story. Wet footprints leading to and from the water, patterns that revealed movement and urgency. Disturbed dirt showing where people had run or stumbled or dragged something heavy. Something dropped in haste, a personal item that fell unnoticed in a moment of panic or confusion. But that night appeared to move carefully, as if nothing had been rushed, as if everything had proceeded calmly and deliberately. Their shoes were removed neatly, placed together in a way that suggested organization rather than panic. Clothing was folded or placed close by in arrangements that looked intentional, thought through, the kind of thing people do when they plan to retrieve items later. Personal items were not scattered randomly across the area as they would be if someone had emptied pockets in a hurry, or if a struggle had occurred. Everything was contained, orderly, positioned in ways that made sense if you were planning to return shortly. It looked like a pause, not an interruption. It looked like the beginning of something routine rather than the end of something catastrophic. And that appearance would become one of the most troubling aspects of the entire case, because it suggested normalcy right up until the moment normalcy ceased completely. The water itself was calm that night according to everyone who later examined conditions. No storm rolled in bringing wind and waves. No sudden weather system cut across the surface creating dangerous situations. The temperature was cool but manageable, exactly what you'd expect for late summer in Colorado. Cold enough to be refreshing but not so cold it would create immediate physical distress. Locals swam there regularly at night during summer months. It was common practice, something teenagers had been doing for years without incident. It wasn't unusual behavior that would raise alarms. It wasn't risky in any obvious way that should have prompted concerns. It wasn't a challenge or a dare, wasn't an attempt to prove something or test limits. It was just swimming, just cooling off, just doing what young people did at that lake in that season. No one knows who entered the water first that night. No one knows if they went in together or separately, if there was hesitation or immediate confidence. No one knows how far they swam from the dock, whether they stayed close or ventured further out into darkness. No one knows what was said in those final moments, whether there was conversation or laughter or silence. There were no witnesses to record the last words spoken, no one to document whether there was joy or concern or something else entirely in those voices. No argument was reported by anyone in the area, no sounds of conflict or distress. No sign of panic rising in the dark, no cries for help that might have brought assistance if anyone had been close enough to hear. The night simply absorbed whatever happened and kept it hidden. By the time the sun came up the next morning, the lake looked exactly the same as it always had. The surface was calm and reflective, undisturbed by anything visible. The dock stood solid and unchanged. The shoreline showed no evidence of emergency or disaster. If you had walked past that morning without knowing 3 teenagers had been there hours earlier, you would have seen nothing that suggested anything was wrong. The scene was peaceful, ordinary, exactly as it had been every other morning that summer. Morning arrived slowly that Saturday, without urgency, the way weekends always did. Houses spread miles apart meant there was no collective awareness, no neighborhood network where one person's concern immediately became everyone's concern. Parents woke expecting the ordinary rhythms of a Saturday morning, the predictable patterns of teenagers sleeping in after staying up late. Doors stayed closed because that was normal. Beds stayed quiet because teenagers needed rest. At first, no one panicked, because there was no immediate reason to panic. Teenagers slept late, especially after summer nights that stretched long and slow. That had always been true, was accepted as part of adolescence, was even welcomed by parents who appreciated a quiet morning. Michael Alen's father noticed the quiet first, but even he didn't immediately assume something was wrong. Michael's truck was gone from where it had been parked, but that wasn't unusual either. He assumed his son had stayed at a friend's place, had maybe decided not to drive home late at night, had made a responsible decision that meant he was safe somewhere else. Or maybe he'd gone out early, was running an errand, was doing something productive while the morning was still cool. There were multiple explanations, all of them reasonable, none of them alarming. Beth Renfro's mother waited longer than she normally would before checking the clock and feeling the first stirring of concern. Beth was reliable in ways that made her predictable, trustworthy in her patterns. If she stayed out late, she usually left a note explaining where she was and when she'd be home. She understood that communication prevented worry, that a few words scribbled on paper gave parents peace of mind. That morning there was no note. The absence was small but notable, the kind of detail that registered as unusual without immediately triggering alarm. Maybe she'd forgotten. Maybe she'd been tired. Maybe she'd come home so late that leaving a note seemed unnecessary. There were explanations. Tess Jenson's parents called her name down the hallway when they woke, a routine morning greeting that usually produced a sleepy response or the sound of movement from her room. They called again, louder, expecting to hear her voice or footsteps. Instead they received only the sound of the house answering back, empty acoustics that suggested absence. They walked to her room, knocked on the door, waited. Nothing. They opened the door to find an empty bed, covers undisturbed in ways that suggested she hadn't come home at all or had left very early without making any noise. By mid-morning, the unease that had been building separately in 3 different households began to surface more consciously. Phone calls were placed casually at first, parents reaching out to other parents, asking if they'd seen the teenagers, if their children knew where the missing 3 might be. Friends were contacted and asked the same questions, each conversation revealing the same answer. No one had seen them that morning, no one knew where they were. A few parents drove short routes they'd driven 100 times before, checking familiar places where teenagers gathered, spots where they might have stopped or stayed. The lake was one possibility. A few other houses were checked. A convenience store was visited. None of these drives led anywhere productive, each one returning without answers, each one deepening the sense that something wasn't right. When those drives led nowhere, the tone of the morning changed noticeably. The concerns stopped being polite and passive and became sharp and active. Parents who had been trying to stay calm began to let worry show in their voices, in the way they asked questions, in how they moved from place to place with increasing urgency. The first real break in the confusion came when someone suggested checking the lake specifically and deliberately. It wasn't an accusation or a theory based on evidence, just a logical thought spoken out loud by someone who knew the teenagers sometimes went there. The dock had always been a gathering place, everyone knew that. If 3 teenagers were missing and no one had seen them anywhere else, it made sense to check there before expanding the search further. When the vehicles were found parked near the lake, the situation crossed a line that couldn't be walked back. What had been worry and confusion hardened instantly into fear. The presence of the vehicles meant the teenagers had been there, had driven there deliberately, and for some reason had not returned. That single discovery transformed the morning from a series of individual concerns into a collective emergency. The cars were unlocked, doors closed but not secured. Keys were missing from ignitions, presumably taken by whoever had parked there. Nothing appeared disturbed in or around the vehicles. No broken glass suggesting violence. No scraped paint indicating collision or struggle. The interiors looked normal, personal items visible in the way they always were. Nothing ransacked or searched or thrown around. The vehicles sat exactly as they would have if their owners had planned to return shortly, had stepped away briefly, had no reason to believe anything was wrong. The walk down to the dock was quiet, people moving carefully, already afraid of what they might find. Parents noticed details they would later replay endlessly in their minds, examining every element for meaning, searching for clues in the landscape itself. The path from the parking area to the dock was clear, well worn from repeated use, showing no signs of struggle or emergency. The ground wasn't torn up by running feet or by someone being dragged. There were no marks suggesting anyone had stumbled badly or fallen or fought. The path looked exactly as it always did, peaceful and undisturbed. At the edge of the water, the scene became more specific and more troubling. Shoes sat neatly together, paired up in ways that suggested they'd been removed carefully and placed deliberately. Clothing rested close by, not tossed aside randomly, not scattered across the dock, not tangled or torn. Items were folded or arranged in small piles that looked intentional. Wallets were present, jewelry was there, everything that teenagers would normally keep with them was accounted for and organized. It was the kind of scene that should have been reassuring, that should have suggested people who were planning to return, who had no reason to believe they wouldn't retrieve these items shortly. Instead, it felt wrong in a way that was hard to articulate clearly but impossible to ignore. People standing there looking at the organized belongings expected chaos, expected panic, expected something that explained absence through visible disruption. Instead, there was order, there was calm, there was a suggestion of normalcy that made the absence of the teenagers even more disturbing. Where were they if everything was so carefully arranged? What had happened that left their belongings behind but took them away? Law enforcement arrived with measured confidence, the kind of professional calm that came from experience responding to emergencies. In rural Colorado in 1986, disappearances like this were extraordinarily rare. Officers had seen drownings before, had responded to accidents near water, understood the protocols for recovery and investigation. This didn't look like a crime scene in any obvious way. There was no evidence of violence, no signs of foul play, nothing that suggested criminal activity. It looked like a recovery situation waiting to happen, a tragedy in progress that would resolve itself through standard procedures. The initial assumption was simple and logical based on what they could see. Midnight swim, cold water despite it being summer, physical fatigue from swimming further than intended or for longer than was safe. An accident that escalated faster than anyone realized, that overwhelmed 3 young people before they could help each other or get back to the dock. It was a tragic explanation, but one that made complete sense given the circumstances. It fit the setting perfectly. It fit the behavior of teenagers doing something they'd done many times before. It fit the expectation that bodies would surface within a predictable time frame, that the water would return what it had taken, that recovery was simply a matter of time and proper searching. The lake was small by any standard, had been measured before for various purposes, was well understood by locals who used it regularly. It didn't have strong currents that could carry bodies significant distances. There were no sudden drop-offs or unexpected depths that locals didn't already know about from years of swimming and fishing. The geography was familiar, contained, manageable. Search leaders believed that with enough time and effort and systematic coverage, the teenagers would be found relatively quickly. It wasn't a question of if, but when. The first search area was mapped quickly and efficiently, officers marking entry points and dividing the shoreline into sections that could be covered methodically. Volunteers arrived in numbers that reflected how closely connected the community was, how personally people took this tragedy even if they didn't know the families directly. People wanted to help, wanted to do something productive, wanted to contribute to finding the teenagers and bringing them home. Search teams spread out along the shoreline, walking slowly, looking carefully at the ground and the water's edge, checking for anything that might provide information. Others moved outward from the immediate area, checking nearby land in case someone had exited the water and wandered off injured or disoriented or in shock. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment saying I'm still here. Let's see who's truly following this shocking story, because what happens next defies every logical explanation investigators had for what should have been a straightforward recovery operation. Divers entered the lake within hours of the vehicles being discovered, moving quickly because everyone understood that time mattered in water recoveries. Visibility was limited in the way it usually is in natural bodies of water, murky enough that divers had to work partly by feel, but manageable by the standards they were accustomed to. They worked methodically, covering areas closest to the dock first because that's where logic said the teenagers would be. They expected to find something almost immediately, anticipated that the first dive or the second would produce results. Clothing caught on branches underwater, a shoe that had drifted near the bottom, a body resting where exhaustion had taken over and a swimmer had simply stopped being able to continue. These were the outcomes they prepared for, the discoveries they expected to make. They found nothing. Divers surfaced and conferred and went down again, expanding their search pattern, checking areas slightly further from the dock, moving more slowly, being even more thorough. They checked again, covering the same ground multiple times because maybe something had been missed, maybe visibility had obscured something important, maybe they needed to move in different patterns to encounter what was there. They checked deeper, descending to the bottom in areas where the lake reached its maximum depth, sweeping their hands across sediment and rocks and submerged vegetation. They surfaced empty-handed every single time, increasingly confused by the absence of any evidence whatsoever. The water gave no resistance, no evidence, no answers. It behaved exactly like water that had never been disturbed, like a lake where nothing had happened, like a place that should have no connection to 3 missing teenagers. That behavior was wrong, contradicted everything investigators expected, violated the normal patterns of water recovery operations. As hours passed and dive teams continued to find nothing, contradictions began to surface in the minds of everyone involved in the search. If one person drowned, recovery could definitely take time, could require extensive searching, could involve complications that delayed finding the body. One person might sink in an unexpected location, might drift further than anticipated, might become caught in vegetation or wedged under debris in ways that made discovery difficult. But 3 people? 3 people in such a contained area? 3 people who had presumably been swimming together or at least in proximity to each other? That defied experience, contradicted what officers knew about water recoveries, challenged the assumptions that had guided every decision so far. Officers discussed among themselves the possibility of staggered accidents, of sequential tragedies where one person got into trouble and others attempted rescue and everyone ended up in distress. It was a familiar scenario in drowning cases, happened often enough that it was always considered as a possibility. But even that explanation didn't hold up under scrutiny. Even in worst-case scenarios where multiple people drowned in a short period, something should have appeared by now. A body should have been recovered, even if the others remained missing temporarily. The complete absence of any physical evidence was deeply troubling in ways that went beyond disappointment into genuine confusion. The absence of debris became increasingly significant as the search continued. No torn fabric floating on the surface or caught on underwater obstacles. No personal items that had drifted away from the dock, carried by whatever minimal current existed in the lake. No marks on the wood of the dock itself that suggested a sudden struggle or frantic movement. No scratches where fingernails had scraped. No dents where someone had struck the structure hard. The dock looked unchanged, appeared exactly as it had before the teenagers arrived, showed no evidence that anything dramatic or violent had occurred there. It was as if the night had passed without incident, as if 3 people had simply evaporated. Parents stood nearby throughout the day, watching professionals do what they could, trying to stay out of the way while remaining close enough to hear updates immediately. At first they held on to belief stubbornly, desperately. Belief in procedure and process, belief in the competence of the people searching, belief in routine outcomes where accidents resolved themselves through effort and expertise. But as the search extended into the afternoon without producing any results, belief thinned noticeably. You could see it in their faces, in how they stood, in the way they spoke to each other in quiet voices that carried resignation alongside hope. The emotional shift was subtle at first but became irreversible as time passed. Confusion about what was happening hardened into dread about what might have happened. Hope became fragile, easily broken by every update that carried no progress, by every diver who surfaced without having found anything, by every hour that passed without answers. Silence filled the spaces between conversations, people running out of reassuring things to say to each other, exhausting the supply of optimistic interpretations. Police officers began to speak more carefully as the day wore on, choosing words with increasing precision, aware that families were listening to every syllable for hints about what might be coming. Words like when, which assumed positive outcomes, were gradually replaced with if, which acknowledged uncertainty and worse possibilities. Timelines stretched from hours to days in the way people talked about the search, preparing families emotionally for the reality that this might not resolve quickly, that they might be facing a long wait for answers. The lake, once assumed to be the answer to the question of where the teenagers were, became itself the central question. How could 3 people disappear so completely from such a small, contained body of water? How could extensive searching produce absolutely nothing? What were they missing? There were no reports of screams that night according to interviews conducted with everyone who lived within earshot of the lake. No nearby residents heard anything unusual, no sounds that stood out from the normal background noise of a summer night in rural Colorado. No passing vehicles noticed lights or movement near the dock, no one remembered seeing anything that seemed worth mentioning. It was as if the teenagers had stepped into a space where sound didn't travel normally, where time didn't behave according to expected rules, where the usual cause and effect relationships between actions and evidence had been suspended. Search leaders reviewed everything they knew about drift patterns in the lake based on minimal currents and prevailing conditions. They considered water temperature and how it affected the physics of drowning, how quickly bodies sank and under what conditions they surfaced. None of it explained the clean absence they were encountering. Bodies should have risen within a certain time frame based on decomposition and gas buildup. Currents, even minimal ones, should have carried something somewhere, should have moved debris or disturbed sediment in detectable ways. The logic that had anchored the investigation from the beginning, that had made everyone confident about quick resolution, began to slip away as that logic failed to produce results. As evening approached and daylight began to fade, floodlights were brought to the site to allow searching to continue after dark. The water was searched again using the artificial light, divers working in shifts to avoid exhaustion. The shoreline was walked again, every foot of accessible bank examined multiple times by different people to ensure nothing was missed. Dogs were brought in to track scent, to follow trails that might lead somewhere useful. The dogs led clearly from the parking area to the dock, following the path the teenagers had obviously taken. But then the trail faded quickly near the dock itself, ended abruptly at the water's edge, provided no continuation into the trees or along the shore. It was another dead end, another piece of evidence that pointed to the lake and then stopped completely. By nightfall the first day, the lake felt different to everyone standing near it. Not threatening exactly, but withholding, keeping secrets, refusing to cooperate with the search in ways that made it seem almost deliberately uncooperative. Parents watched the surface under the floodlights, waiting for it to give something back, expecting at any moment to see something appear that would explain everything. It didn't. The surface remained calm and empty and maddeningly unhelpful. Law enforcement was forced to acknowledge what no one wanted to say aloud as the first day ended without results. This was no longer a routine recovery operation. The evidence, or rather the complete lack of evidence, didn't match the assumptions that had driven the initial response. The scene didn't behave like a straightforward accident. Something else was happening here, something that didn't fit familiar patterns, something that was going to require different thinking and more resources and possibly a fundamental reconsideration of what had actually occurred that night. 3 teenagers had disappeared from a place that should not have allowed them to disappear so completely. And as search teams prepared to return the next day to continue looking, exhaustion settled over everyone involved in ways that went beyond physical tiredness. Parents went home to houses that felt fundamentally wrong without the sound of their children, without the presence that had filled those spaces for 17 and 18 and 16 years. Officers filed reports that raised more questions than they answered, that documented extensive efforts producing 0 results, that captured the confusion everyone was feeling. And beneath the still surface of the lake, the absence remained complete and unexplained. By the time the sun rose again on the second day, the search would continue with more urgency and less certainty, with increasing resources and decreasing confidence. Because if the water was not hiding the truth in the usual places, if bodies were not resting on the lake bed waiting to be found, if the normal recovery timeline was not going to apply, then whatever had happened that night was far more complicated than anyone had initially imagined. And the lake was not going to give up its secrets easily. The search intensified over the following days and weeks in ways that felt methodical on paper and increasingly frantic in practice. What began as a focused recovery effort with clear objectives and confident leadership expanded into a full-scale operation that stretched across days, then weeks, then began measuring time in months. Divers returned to the water again and again, adjusting their search patterns based on new theories, recalculating depths in case earlier measurements had been wrong, widening grids to cover areas that seemed unlikely but couldn't be completely ruled out. Volunteers lined the shoreline each morning, walking the same ground repeatedly in shifts, hoping that repetition might reveal what precision and expertise had missed, that fresh eyes might see something that tired eyes had overlooked. The lake itself became a subject of constant study and re-examination. Its dimensions were logged meticulously, and then logged again to verify accuracy. Depth charts that had existed for years were redrawn with more precision, every contour mapped, every depression noted, every feature catalogued. Officers measured distances from the dock to the far banks over and over, marking zones where bodies should have settled based on how drowning typically works, where they should have surfaced based on known patterns, where they might have drifted based on minimal currents. In similar cases from other jurisdictions, time had proven to be an ally in recovery efforts. Decomposition created buoyancy that made bodies rise toward the surface. Water systems eventually returned what they had taken, gave back what they had temporarily held. But here, in this specific lake, time passed without producing any change in the situation. Days became weeks and the lake continued to yield nothing. Dive teams worked under conditions that were challenging but not prohibitive by any reasonable standard. The water temperature hovered in a range consistent with late summer in Colorado at that elevation, cold enough to slow physical responses and make prolonged exposure uncomfortable, but not so cold that it would instantly erase trace evidence, or make diving impossible. Visibility was limited by the natural murkiness of the water, by sediment stirred up during searching, by the way light penetrated only so far before being absorbed completely. But it was manageable by the standards of the era, comparable to many other bodies of water where successful recoveries had been completed. Divers weren't working blind, weren't facing conditions that made searching impossible. They relied heavily on tactile searches, sweeping their hands methodically across the lake bed, probing carefully around submerged logs and rocks and debris that accumulated naturally over years. They expected to encounter obstacles, anticipated that searching would be difficult, understood that finding small objects in murky water required patience and thoroughness. What they didn't expect, what no one had anticipated, was total absence. Not a shoe that had come off during swimming and sunk to the bottom. Not a scrap of fabric torn from clothing during struggle or panic. Not any sign whatsoever that anyone had been in distress in this water, had struggled against drowning, had sunk to the bottom after exhaustion claimed them. The absence was so complete it began to feel impossible, as if they were searching for something that had never existed rather than something that was simply difficult to locate. Sonar equipment available in the mid-1980s was basic compared to what would come later, designed primarily to identify large objects rather than provide detailed imaging or fine resolution. The technology worked by sending sound waves through water and measuring how they bounce back, creating rough images based on density and size. Even with those limitations, sonar should have registered something if 3 bodies were resting on the lake bed. The equipment should have shown anomalies, should have flagged areas worth investigating more closely with divers. Instead, screens showed only the natural contours of the lake bottom and occasional shadows that resolve into nothing upon direct inspection. Every piece of debris flagged by sonar turned out to be a log or a rock or some piece of old equipment that had been dumped in the lake years or decades earlier. Each negative result deepened the contradiction at the heart of the case. Whether records were pulled and reviewed meticulously to verify that conditions the night of the disappearance had been what witnesses remembered. There had been no sudden temperature drop overnight that might have created dangerous conditions unexpectedly, no storms that could have generated waves or strong winds, no heavy weather system that could have driven swimmers into dangerous currents or caused panic. The lake did not connect to any larger waterways that could have carried bodies downstream or into other water systems. It was self-contained, controlled entirely by its own geography, bordered on all sides by land that had already been searched thoroughly multiple times. There was no outlet through which bodies could have left the lake, no hidden channel that might explain the disappearance. Investigators considered carefully the possibility that one teenager had drowned first, and the others had attempted rescue, getting into trouble themselves while trying to help. It was a familiar scenario in drowning cases, tragic but logical, something that explained multiple deaths in close proximity. People who attempt water rescue without training often become victims themselves, pulled under by panicking swimmers, exhausted by the effort of trying to support another person's weight while treading water. Yet even that theory failed under closer scrutiny of this specific situation. In rescue attempts, panic leaves visible marks on a scene. Clothing gets tangled as people grab at each other. The dock or surrounding area shows signs of frantic activity as people climb out and go back in or hold onto structures for support. Something breaks or falls or gets disturbed in ways that reflect emergency. Here, everything remained orderly and routine and undisturbed in ways that didn't fit a rescue scenario at all. Another theory that gained temporary traction suggested the teenagers might have exited the water unseen somehow and wandered into nearby land, possibly injured or disoriented or in a state of shock that prevented them from calling for help or finding their way back to the vehicles. Tracking dogs were brought in specifically to test this possibility, to follow scent trails that might lead away from the immediate area of the dock. The dogs worked the scene carefully, their handlers watching for any indication that a trail existed leading into the surrounding forest or farmland. The results were conclusive and disappointing. Scent trails led clearly from the parking area to the dock, following the path the teenagers had obviously taken. But then the trails faded completely at the edge of the water. No path continued into the trees. No trail suggested movement away from the dock along the shoreline. The scent simply ended where the water began, as if the teenagers had walked to that point and then ceased to exist. It was another dead end, another theory that collapsed under testing. As days turned into weeks without any progress, the tone of the investigation shifted noticeably. Officers who had initially spoken with confidence and certainty began choosing their words more carefully, hedging their statements, qualifying their assessments. Reports grew longer and more detailed as investigators tried to capture every element of what they were encountering, documenting the absence of evidence as thoroughly as they would have documented its presence. Each new theory proposed by someone was tested as rigorously as possible, examined from multiple angles, and then dismantled piece by piece when it failed to explain what they were seeing. The theories were discarded reluctantly, each one representing hope that there was a logical explanation that just needed to be found. Community speculation filled the vacuum left by official unanswered questions. In a town where silence felt unbearable, where people desperately wanted explanations that would make sense of the tragedy, rumors spread quickly and evolved rapidly. Some people whispered about drugs despite the complete absence of any evidence that the teenagers used substances or had been impaired that night. Others suggested outsiders passing through the area, perhaps criminals who had encountered the teenagers and done something terrible, despite no reports of suspicious vehicles or unfamiliar people or any activity that would support such a theory. A few people began to imply secrets within the families themselves, suggesting that maybe the teenagers had been running from something or hiding something, implications that quietly collapsed under even basic scrutiny but left damage behind in relationships and reputations. Police worked diligently to separate noise from fact, to distinguish between information that might be useful and speculation that was just people trying to process their fear and confusion. They documented every tip that came in, no matter how unlikely it seemed, no matter how clearly it contradicted known facts. They followed every lead, even when logic and experience said it would end nowhere, because they couldn't afford to dismiss something that might actually matter. Most of those leads did end nowhere, resulting in wasted time and energy but revealing nothing useful about what had happened to the three teenagers. Each dead end, each failed theory, each negative result from searching added weight to the sense that something fundamental was missing from how everyone was thinking about the case. The equation wasn't balancing. The inputs weren't producing the expected outputs. Somewhere in their understanding of what had happened, there was a gap, a piece of missing information or a wrong assumption that was preventing the case from resolving the way similar cases typically did. The families began to change as the reality of the situation settled over them gradually but irreversibly. At first they had clung desperately to daily updates, had asked the same questions over and over hoping the answers would suddenly shift and bring good news. They attended every briefing, stood at the lake watching searches, maintained hope through sheer force of will. Over time, as day after day brought no progress, hope narrowed and became more fragile. Conversations between family members and investigators became quieter, less energetic, marked by exhaustion and resignation. Parents stopped asking when their children would be found and started asking how it was possible that they couldn't be found, how three people could vanish so completely from such a small, known space. Search schedules gradually thinned, not because effort or commitment diminished, but because repetition had yielded nothing new and resources were finite. Divers revisited areas that had already been cleared multiple times, checking for mistakes, looking for anything they might have missed during earlier searches. They found none. The areas that had been searched correctly and thoroughly. The problem wasn't technique or effort. The problem was that there was nothing there to find in the places everyone expected bodies to be. Investigators reviewed the physics of drowning again, consulting with experts, reading studies, trying to understand if there was some scenario they hadn't considered. In controlled environments and based on extensive research and case histories, bodies submerged in water surface within predictable windows of time. The time frame varies based on water temperature and other factors, but there are ranges that apply in most situations. For this lake, given its temperature and conditions, bodies should have surfaced within days or at most a couple of weeks. That window passed. Then it passed again as more time elapsed. Each day without recovery weakened the accidental drowning theory until it no longer held any explanatory power at all. Something else had to be happening. Foul play entered official discussions cautiously and reluctantly. No one wanted to believe that three teenagers had been murdered or abducted, that something criminal rather than accidental had occurred. But as natural explanations failed one after another, investigators had to consider possibilities they initially dismissed. The problem was that foul play theories faced the same evidentiary problems as accident theories. There was no blood anywhere at the scene. No evidence of violence on the dock or the surrounding area. No signs of struggle that would indicate people had been forced to do something against their will. No motive anyone could identify that would explain why someone would want to harm these particular teenagers. No suspects who made any sense. No reports of unfamiliar vehicles or unknown people in the area. And yet the absence itself, the complete disappearance of three people without any trace, began to feel intentional rather than accidental. Accidents left evidence. Crimes sometimes left nothing but absence. The dock itself drew increasing attention from investigators as other avenues closed off, not because it showed damage or obvious evidence, but precisely because it didn't. It remained steady and unchanged and present exactly where it had always been. In some ways it became the most significant piece of physical evidence in the case simply by virtue of being the last place anyone knew the teenagers had been. The place where everything ended and nothing began. Investigators examined it repeatedly, measuring it, photographing it from every angle, testing its stability, looking for anything unusual about its construction or condition. It was just a dock, old but well maintained, sturdy enough to support people, showing wear consistent with years of use. There was nothing obviously wrong with it, nothing that suggested it had played any active role in what happened. As summer faded into fall and temperatures began to drop, the search formally scaled back from daily operations to periodic efforts. Files were reorganized and consolidated. Evidence, such as it was carefully catalogued and stored. Leads that had been marked active were now marked inactive, moved into different categories that reflected their status. Officers began using language designed to prepare families emotionally for a future without answers, phrases like ongoing investigation and continued efforts that sounded active but really meant the case was entering a different phase, moving from active emergency response to long-term unresolved status. That realization, that shift, landed unevenly among the families. Some parents refused to accept it, insisted that searching continue, that more be done, that someone somewhere must know something. Others began the painful process of preparing themselves emotionally even as they resisted the thought of giving up. They understood logically that resources were limited, that investigators couldn't search the same lake forever, that at some point active operations had to end even if the case remained officially open. Understanding didn't make it easier. Grief settled in stages, wave after wave, interrupted periodically by bursts of renewed hope whenever a rumor surfaced or someone called in a tip that seemed promising. But nothing ever broke the silence of the lake. Nothing ever brought the teenagers back or explained where they had gone. The lake froze that winter, its surface sealing under ice that reflected the gray sky and created a new landscape over the water that had taken so much. The dock stood firm above the ice, visible and accessible but surrounded now by a solid surface rather than liquid. For the first time since the disappearance, the search truly paused, not by official decision but by season and weather that made diving impossible. Families watched the ice form and thicken and knew that months would pass before water could be searched again, months of waiting and wondering while the lake held whatever secrets it possessed locked beneath frozen surface. And as investigators closed their notebooks and families returned home to empty rooms that would remain empty, one truth became completely unavoidable to everyone involved. Whatever had happened to Michael Alen and Beth Renfro and Tess Jenson was not something the water intended to give back easily or perhaps at all. Because if weeks of intensive professional searching had produced absolutely nothing, if the lake had been examined and re-examined and searched with every technique available and still yielded no evidence, then the answer they were looking for was not simply waiting to be found through more effort. It was waiting to be understood through different thinking. And no one yet knew how to think differently enough to solve what had become one of the most baffling disappearances anyone in rural Colorado had ever encountered. By the end of the first year following the disappearance, the language around the case had changed in subtle but significant ways. Not officially through press releases or formal announcements that stated new policies, but in the way officers spoke to families during occasional updates, and in the way reports were filed and categorized within the department. Active search, which implied daily operations and dedicated resources, became ongoing investigation, which suggested periodic attention and responsiveness to new information. Ongoing investigation gradually became limited follow-up, which meant the case was being maintained but not actively worked in any meaningful sense. Eventually, without any ceremony or formal declaration, the case slipped into what law enforcement classification systems called inactive status. The word cold was never used out loud in conversations with families because it seemed harsh and final, but everyone understood what inactive meant. It meant the case was unsolved and likely to remain that way unless something dramatic changed. Boxes replaced briefcases as the primary storage method for case materials. Evidence logs were finalized with notations indicating that all items had been cataloged and preserved. Dive maps showing search patterns were rolled up carefully and stored in tubes, archived against the possibility that someday they might need to be referenced again. The lake was no longer searched on any regular schedule. Daily operations ceased first. Then weekly check-ins stopped. Eventually even monthly reviews faded away as other cases demanded attention and resources. What had once felt urgent and immediate, dominating the thoughts and efforts of an entire department, became archival, something that belonged to the past rather than the present. The disappearance of 3 teenagers, once the center of constant community attention and conversation, faded gradually into something people referenced in the past tense during occasional discussions about unsolved mysteries or tragic events. It became part of local history rather than current crisis, a story that older residents told newer arrivals as a way of explaining that even here, even in a place that felt safe, terrible things could happen without explanation. For the families, time did not soften anything about their loss. If anything, it sharpened the pain in certain ways, made it more specific and personal as the years separated them further from the last moments they had spent with their children. Birthdays arrived like interruptions in the flow of normal life, impossible to ignore, forcing awareness of how old Michael and Beth and Tess would have been if they were still alive, what stages of life they should have been experiencing. Empty chairs appeared at holiday tables, absences that family gatherings made more obvious rather than less. Rooms were left untouched longer than anyone originally planned, becoming almost shrines to frozen moments in time, preserving the lives of 17-year-old and 16-year-old teenagers who never got to grow into adults. Parents learned gradually and painfully how to function while carrying unanswered questions that never stopped forming in their minds. Every phone call, even years later, carried a brief irrational hope that this would be the call that brought news, that explained everything, that returned what had been taken. Every knock at the door felt heavier than it should have, loaded with possibility that someone had finally found answers. Those hopes were disappointed so many times that eventually most people stopped acknowledging them consciously, but they never truly disappeared. Michael Alen's parents aged quietly and visibly in ways that seemed to accelerate after his disappearance. They marked time not by calendars showing months and years but by the years since he'd been gone, measuring their lives against that central dividing moment. 5 years since Michael disappeared. 10 years. 15. The numbers grew but the wound never really closed. Beth Renfro's family held on to routines longer than they probably needed to, maintaining schedules and traditions as if consistency might somehow pull her back into the present, might create enough familiar pattern that she could find her way home. They kept her room exactly as it had been, changed nothing about how they structured their days, resisted the idea that moving forward meant accepting she was gone permanently. Tess Jenson's parents oscillated between fierce determination and crushing exhaustion, going through cycles where they threw energy into finding answers and then collapsing into periods where they could barely function. They wrote letters to government officials and law enforcement departments. They called agencies requesting reviews of the case. They revisited the same conversations with investigators dozens of times, asking if new techniques existed, if anything had been missed, if there was any possibility of renewed searching. The answers were always sympathetic but ultimately negative. There was nothing new to pursue. Everything that could be done had been done. Investigators assigned to the case weren't immune to the emotional toll it took. Some transferred to different departments or different jurisdictions, seeking fresh starts away from a case that had frustrated and haunted them. Others retired from law enforcement entirely, carrying the weight of this unsolved disappearance into their civilian lives. A few investigators who felt particularly connected to the case continued to carry it with them even after it was no longer their professional responsibility. They reopened files late at night in their personal time, spreading out reports and photographs and maps on kitchen tables, trying to solve it privately when official avenues had closed. They circled the same unanswered questions endlessly, approaching them from different angles, hoping that somehow new perspective would reveal what had been missed. They were frustrated by how clean the absence remained after all this time, how completely 3 people had vanished without leaving the kinds of traces that usually solved cases. The doc stayed standing through all of those years. That fact began to take on psychological weight as time passed and seasons cycled. It was repaired periodically when boards warped from weather exposure or rotted from moisture. It was repainted every few years when the wood faded and maintenance became necessary. Locals continued to use it exactly as they always had, continued to fish from its weathered planks, to sit quietly at night watching stars reflect on the water, to let their children jump into the lake during hot summer days when cooling off seemed like the most natural thing in the world. Life continued flowing around the exact geographical point where 3 lives had stopped permanently. No one in any official capacity ever ordered the dock preserved as evidence. No one sealed it off or restricted access or treated it as a crime scene that needed protection. It was never formally designated as evidence because there was nothing visibly wrong with it, nothing that suggested it had played any role in what happened beyond being the location where the teenagers were last seen. And that lack of obvious significance became part of the problem that would eventually matter. The dock was allowed to age naturally, to be modified and repaired as needed, without anyone considering that it might contain information relevant to the disappearance. Every few years something would cause the case to resurface briefly in public awareness. An anniversary of the disappearance would prompt a newspaper article or a television news segment revisiting the mystery. A rumor would circulate through the community that someone knew something or that new evidence had been found, rumors that investigation always revealed to be baseless. Occasionally a tip would come in from someone who claimed to have information, tips that investigators dutifully followed up on even though they almost never led anywhere productive. During these periodic resurgences of attention, officers would pull out the file and re-review it carefully, hoping that time might have altered their perspective enough to see something new, that distance might provide clarity that hadn't existed during the immediate crisis. They noticed the same things every time they reviewed the case. The same contradictions that had troubled investigators from the beginning. The same missing pieces that had never been found. The same questions that had no good answers. How did 3 people disappear from such a contained location without disturbing anything? Why was there absolutely no sign of struggle or panic or desperate attempt to escape? Why did the water give nothing back when water almost always eventually returns what it takes? The questions remained as sharp and unanswerable as they had been on day 1. The dock began to feel less like a neutral backdrop to the tragedy and more like an unanswered question itself, a physical presence that somehow mattered more than anyone understood. It wasn't just present in the landscape. It was persistent, enduring through years while everything else about the case faded into archives. It contradicted every theory that investigators had developed without actively disproving any of them. It sat there unchanged in its essential form despite repairs and modifications, as if daring someone to explain what role it had played, what information it held, why it mattered beyond being a location marker. The community learned gradually to live with the discomfort of not knowing what had happened. New families moved into the area over the years, drawn by affordable land and rural lifestyle. They heard the story eventually from longer-term residents, and absorbed it as part of local lore, aware of what had happened but emotionally detached from it in ways that people who had lived through it could never be. Older residents who remembered that summer spoke about it carefully when they did mention it, lowering their voices when they said the names of the 3 teenagers, treating the subject with the reverence people reserve for genuine tragedy that touched their community directly. Teenagers growing up in the years after the disappearance still went to the lake regularly. They still swam at night during summer months when heat made the cool water irresistible. They still trusted the place the way their parents had once trusted it before everything changed. And remarkably, disturbingly, nothing else ever happened there that raised similar alarms. There were no repeat incidents, no accidents that resulted in drowning or injury or any situation that required emergency response. That absence of further tragedy was itself unsettling to some people. If the lake was somehow dangerous, why had it only claimed victims that one night? If it wasn't dangerous, what explained what had happened to Michael and Beth and Tess? As the years stretched into decades, investigators occasionally revisited the small anomalies that had once seemed too minor to build theories around but had never been completely explained. The unusual neatness of the belongings left on the dock. The complete absence of any debris or torn fabric or lost items. The lack of natural drift patterns in the water that should have moved something somewhere. The tracking dogs losing scent precisely at the dock rather than showing any trail continuing away from it. Each detail had been examined extensively during the initial investigation, had been documented and discussed and incorporated into various theories. But now, with the passage of time and the failure of all conventional explanations, they felt different. They carried more weight precisely because nothing new had replaced them or explained them away. Time itself became an adversary in certain respects. Witnesses forgot details as memories faded naturally over years and decades. Things that had seemed clear and significant in 1986 became fuzzy and uncertain by the mid-90s and beyond. Memories softened and merged with each other, making it difficult to separate what people actually remembered from what they had read in reports or heard in discussions. Some people who had been teenagers themselves when Michael and Beth and Tess disappeared moved away from the area as adults, scattering to different states and cities, becoming difficult to contact if investigators wanted to re-interview them. Other residents, including some who had been involved in the initial search, passed away from natural causes as the decades accumulated, taking their observations and impressions with them permanently. The case aged in ways that made resolution seem increasingly unlikely with each passing year. The window for finding physical evidence narrowed and then closed completely. The possibility of eyewitness testimony emerging decreased as people's memories became less reliable and as potential witnesses themselves aged or died. The investigation became a historical artifact as much as an active case, something people studied more than actively worked. For the families, the enemy was not just the passage of time itself but the normalization that came with it. The world adjusted to the absence of Michael and Beth and Tess in ways that their families never could. Society moved on. New tragedies captured attention. The case stopped being actively discussed except during specific anniversaries or when someone with particular interests brought it up. The families resisted strongly against phrases like closure and acceptance, and moving on that well-meaning people sometimes suggested. Those words implied an ending, suggested that at some point you could draw a line under this chapter and start a new one. There wasn't an ending. There was only ongoing absence, continuous not knowing, permanent suspension in a state where the people they loved were either confirmed dead nor possibly alive. It was a kind of limbo that made grief more complicated and more enduring. Years later, when new investigators who hadn't been involved in the original case were assigned to review the file as part of routine cold case assessment, they noticed something that earlier teams hadn't focused on long enough or considered significant enough. The dock had not only remained intact and functional throughout the decades since the disappearance. It had also been altered over time in ways that were well documented in county maintenance records but had never been examined through the lens of the investigation. The structure had been reinforced with new supports in some areas. It had been repaired extensively at certain points. It had been modified in small practical ways that made perfect sense for routine maintenance of an aging structure but that complicated forensic assumptions about what the dock had looked like on the night of the disappearance, and in the months immediately following. What if, some investigators began to wonder quietly among themselves, the dock hadn't just witnessed the disappearance? What if it had somehow been part of how the truth stayed hidden for so long? The question lingered in case review meetings and informal discussions, unspoken for a long time because there was no evidence to support it, no proof to contradict it, just an uncomfortable feeling that grew stronger the more people thought about it. The feeling that the place itself mattered more than anyone had realized, that focusing exclusively on the water as the location of the tragedy had potentially caused investigators to miss something about the structure that stood above and within that water. That question, vague and unsettling, would eventually matter enormously. But for years it remained just speculation, just an uncomfortable feeling that something had been missed, something fundamental that had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. The families learned through difficult experience to live in a state of suspended grief that became their permanent condition. Not knowing what had happened became something they carried with them constantly rather than something they thought about occasionally. It shaped their identities, influenced their decisions, colored how they experienced every aspect of their lives. They aged into this reality, absorbed it so completely that it became part of who they were. Some of them stopped talking to media over the years, exhausted by repeating the same story and answering the same questions without ever getting closer to answers. Others never stopped hoping that publicity might somehow shake loose information that had remained hidden, That someone watching or reading might finally come forward with the piece of the puzzle that explained everything. The lake continued its natural cycles completely indifferent to human tragedy. It froze every winter, its surface becoming solid enough to walk on, and thawed every spring, returning to liquid and resuming its role in the local ecosystem. Seasons cycled through their familiar patterns. Wildlife used the lake without any awareness of its significance to humans. The dock stood firm through all of it, through winter ice and spring floods and summer heat and autumn cold, maintaining its position and function year after year after year. And then, more than 2 decades after 3 teenagers had vanished from that dock without explanation, something changed. Not because someone came looking for the teenagers again with renewed determination. Not because of a confession from someone who had carried guilty knowledge for years. Not because of a breakthrough tip from a witness who had finally decided to speak. The change came because technology had advanced enough to see what earlier searches had never been able to detect, to map what had remained invisible, to reveal what had been present all along but hidden just beyond the reach of the tools available in 1986. When divers returned to the lake for reasons completely unrelated to the decades-old case, they carried equipment that represented a quantum leap in capability compared to what had been available to their predecessors. And as those tools began systematically mapping the water in ways no one had been able to before, the dock finally stopped being just a silent witness to tragedy. It started to tell a story that no one had ever considered, a story that had been waiting 22 years to be heard. In the summer of 2008, the lake was not being revisited because anyone had renewed interest in solving the mystery of the 3 missing teenagers. Their case had been cold for so long, had been inactive for so many years, that it no longer influenced planning decisions or budget allocations or operational priorities for any law enforcement agency. The reason divers returned to that specific body of water had absolutely nothing to do with missing persons investigations or criminal cases of any kind. It was environmental work, routine assessment tied to water quality monitoring, erosion pattern documentation, and structural aging evaluation around older docks in rural areas throughout the county. The kind of unglamorous technical work that happened quietly without media coverage, without families watching anxiously from the shore, without any expectation that it would produce dramatic discoveries. What had changed fundamentally since 1986 was not the lake itself, which remained essentially the same body of water it had always been. What had changed was the technology available for examining that water and everything in it. Modern sonar systems of the type now considered standard equipment for professional dive operations were far more precise than anything that had existed 2 decades earlier. These weren't the basic instruments that had been used in the original search, systems that could only register large objects and provide rough approximations of what might be underwater. These new systems didn't just detect the presence of something solid in the water. They mapped shapes with remarkable precision. They measured density variations. They identified irregularities in the lake bed that earlier technology would have completely missed. They provided visual representations with clarity that investigators working in 1986 literally could not have imagined would someday be possible from equipment operated from the surface. The survey team conducting the routine environmental assessment expected to find exactly what survey teams usually found in bodies of water that had been used by humans for decades. Debris that had accumulated over time, old barrels that had been dumped illegally, discarded equipment from fishing or recreational activities that had been lost and abandoned, natural buildup of sediment and organic material around structures. When the sonar flagged anomalies near the old dock, no one reacted with any particular urgency or excitement at first. Anomalies were completely common in this kind of work, happened on virtually every survey of every lake. Logs shifted position over years as they decayed and moved. Sediment formed unevenly across lake beds based on current patterns and deposition rates. Metal objects sank decades earlier and corroded slowly underwater. It was just part of the job to identify these anomalies, investigate them enough to understand what they were, and rule out false positives that had no significance. But these particular readings flagged by the sonar system didn't behave like typical debris when the technician examined them more closely. The shapes were clustered together in ways that seemed purposeful rather than random. They were positioned too evenly, with too much regularity, to be natural accumulation of objects that had settled independently over time. And they were located directly beneath and immediately adjacent to the dock structure in areas that historical records showed had been searched repeatedly and extensively in the past, but had never been examined with this level of resolution, had never been seen with the kind of clarity this equipment provided. Divers were sent down to physically inspect the anomalies, expecting to confirm that these were just natural obstructions, probably old logs embedded in sediment, or rocks that had unusual shapes. They didn't find what they expected when they reached the locations the sonar had identified. Beneath the dock, in the space where water met shadow and where decades of assumptions had prevented proper examination, they found structural elements that had not been part of the original construction of the dock according to records they later reviewed. Reinforcements that didn't match the materials or techniques documented in the earliest available records of the dock's construction. Weight-bearing additions that had been installed at some point years after the dock was originally built, with some of them clearly dating to repairs and modifications made in the early 1990s based on the condition of the materials and the methods used to attach them. These elements weren't falling apart or decaying. They were relatively well preserved, still functional, still doing whatever job they had been designed to do. What unsettled the dive team immediately, what made them pause their routine assessment and start documenting everything much more carefully, wasn't simply the presence of added structural material that hadn't been part of original construction. Lots of old structures got reinforced and modified over time. That was completely normal. What troubled them was how this material was arranged, how the additions were positioned, how the reinforcements were distributed. These weren't casual fixes done by someone who had noticed the problem and thrown some lumber at it without much thought. They were deliberate placements, carefully balanced, precisely positioned in ways that suggested they had been designed to stabilize something specific beneath the surface of the water, to hold something in place, to prevent something from shifting or moving or surfacing. As divers moved carefully through the space beneath the dock, documenting each element they found and marking positions for detailed mapping, they began noticing other features that hadn't shown up clearly on the sonar but became obvious during direct physical inspection. There were voids in the sediment at the bottom of the lake beneath the dock, hollow spaces where the lake bed should have been relatively uniform based on the surrounding topography. There were areas that suggested disturbance at some point in the past followed by deliberate coverage, the kind of layered pattern that gets created when something is placed in sediment, possibly weighted or secured, and then left undisturbed for extended periods while natural processes slowly bury it further. The disturbances weren't recent, weren't fresh. They were old, very old, preserved remarkably well by the cold water temperature and the lack of oxygen at the bottom of the lake that slowed decay and decomposition dramatically. The water, after 22 years of keeping secrets, was finally giving something back. Just not in the way anyone had imagined during all those years of searching and waiting. Authorities were notified quietly and professionally without any dramatic announcements. There was no press release, no public statement, no alert sent to media outlets. The survey team leader made a series of phone calls following established protocols for when environmental assessment work unexpectedly encounters something that might be connected to law enforcement matters. The case number associated with that particular location triggered an immediate cascade of additional phone calls that reached across multiple departments and spanned years of personnel changes. Retired investigators who had worked the original case were contacted at their homes and told that something significant had been found at the lake. Files that had been stored in archives for years, gathering dust in boxes stacked in climate-controlled rooms, were suddenly pulled out and brought back to active case rooms. Names that hadn't been spoken in professional contexts for decades, names that belonged to victims rather than witnesses or suspects, resurfaced in official language and active investigations. Michael Alen, Beth Renfro, Tess Jenson. When law enforcement returned to the lake in an official investigative capacity for the first time in years, they did so with a completely different mindset than had guided their approach in 1986. This was explicitly no longer being treated as a recovery operation with the goal of finding and retrieving bodies. This was now a forensic reassessment with the goal of understanding exactly what had happened and why evidence had remained hidden for so long. The fundamental assumption that what occurred had been a straightforward accidental drowning was no longer being treated as the default explanation that should guide investigative decisions. Every element of the scene was going to be examined through the possibility that concealment had occurred, that evidence had been deliberately hidden, that the original search had failed not because of investigator error or technological limitation but because someone had actively prevented discovery. Divers focused their efforts on the areas directly beneath and around the dock's modified sections, the structural elements that had been added years after the original construction. What they began uncovering in those locations over the course of careful, painstaking excavation forced investigators to confront a truth they had never seriously considered during the original investigation. The dock had not merely remained intact and functional after the disappearance, as a neutral element of the landscape. It had been deliberately altered in ways that may have been specifically designed to hide what the water alone could not conceal. Sediment samples taken from the areas beneath the dock revealed layering that was completely inconsistent with natural buildup that occurs gradually over years from organic material settling and decomposing. There were clear signs of displacement where sediment had been disturbed at a specific point in time, followed by coverage where material had been placed over the disturbed areas, followed by many years of undisturbed natural accumulation on top of everything. The pattern was exactly what gets created when something is intentionally placed in a specific location, possibly weighted or anchored to prevent movement, and then left completely undisturbed for long periods while natural processes gradually conceal it further. Cold water temperatures near the bottom of the lake had slowed biological decay processes dramatically, preserving materials and maintaining structures that might have degraded completely in warmer conditions. The darkness at that depth, the absence of light penetration, had contributed to preservation by preventing photodegradation and limiting the activity of organisms that typically break down organic materials. The findings didn't immediately reveal everything, didn't answer every question in one dramatic moment of discovery. But they revealed enough to fundamentally change the case. When forensic teams began analyzing the materials that were carefully recovered from beneath the dock and from the disturbed sediment layers, they found trace elements that matched clothing fibers associated with items the teenagers had been wearing on the night they disappeared. The fibers were microscopic in size, heavily degraded by years of submersion and exposure to water chemistry, but present in sufficient quantity, and with sufficient identifying characteristics to establish definitive connections. It was enough to prove proximity. It was enough to establish that the teenagers had been in these specific locations. It was enough to completely change how the case was understood. The call to the families was made carefully and professionally by investigators who understood exactly how devastating and complex this information would be. There was no promise of complete resolution, no guarantee that every question would now be answered, only honest acknowledgement that something significant had been found that fundamentally changed understanding of what had happened. For parents who had lived for decades without any meaningful updates, who had learned to expect disappointment from every contact with law enforcement, the shock of finally receiving substantive information was almost physical in its impact. Time collapsed in an instant. The night of the disappearance, which had slowly faded into memory over 22 years, returned in full vivid detail as if it had just happened. The emotional impact was overwhelming, impossible to process quickly. Some families reacted with hope, desperate hope that maybe this meant their children could finally come home even if only for burial. Others reacted with dread, knowing that discovery after this much time meant there could be no miracle of finding them alive. All of them responded with profound exhaustion that came from carrying unanswered questions for most of their adult lives and suddenly being told that answers might finally exist. Investigators began the meticulous work of reviewing all available repair records tied to the dock, maintenance logs that documented work performed over the decades, property ownership changes that might be relevant, contractors who had performed structural work at various points in time. Most of those records were frustratingly incomplete. County maintenance records from the late 80s and early 90s were spotty at best, not systematically organized, often missing key details about who performed work or exactly what was done. Some records had been lost entirely over the years as filing systems changed and documents were transferred between storage facilities. Other records led to people who no longer lived anywhere near the area or who no longer had any memory of specific jobs performed 20 years earlier among hundreds of similar projects. Still, patterns began to emerge as investigators compiled and cross-referenced everything they could find. Repairs had been made to the dock within months of the disappearance, not announced publicly, not documented thoroughly in ways that would stand out, carefully framed as routine reinforcement and maintenance of an aging structure. At the time, no one had questioned the work because the dock was indeed old and did require periodic maintenance to remain safe for public use. But now, examined through the lens of what had been found beneath the structure, those repairs took on entirely different meaning and significance. The timing was suspicious. The extent of the work was greater than what simple maintenance would typically require. The specific locations where reinforcements were added corresponded closely to areas where evidence had now been discovered. The possibility that the dock had been deliberately used as a tool to conceal evidence completely reframed everything about the case. It explained the absence that had mystified investigators for more than 2 decades. It explained why bodies never drifted despite currents that should have moved them. It explained why extensive, professional searching had found absolutely nothing. Investigators in 1986 had searched the water systematically and thoroughly using the best techniques and technology available to them. They had not searched the dock structure itself as a container, as a concealment device, because there had been no reason to consider it in that light. The dock was visible, solid, present, obviously intact. It didn't appear damaged or suspicious. It looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, a simple structure for accessing the water. The accident theory that had guided thinking from the very beginning collapsed completely under this new understanding. The physics of drowning no longer mattered if bodies had never been free to float or drift according to natural laws. The timeline that had seemed so puzzling made sense if human action rather than natural processes had determined where remains stayed and how they were concealed. The water itself was not the sole environment that needed to be considered. The structure within and above the water was equally important, potentially more important, and had been essentially ignored during the original investigation. As evidence continued to accumulate through careful forensic analysis and methodical excavation, investigators faced a painful reality about accountability and justice. Even if remains were fully recovered, even if definitive conclusions were drawn about exactly what had happened and how concealment had occurred, legal accountability for those actions might never be possible to achieve. Too much time had passed. Statutes of limitations had run out on most potential charges related to concealment or tampering with evidence. Witnesses had aged or died, taking their knowledge with them. Records were incomplete or missing entirely. Memories had faded to the point where testimony would be unreliable even from people who had been directly involved. What remained after 22 years was the possibility of truth without the guarantee of justice, of understanding without punishment, of answers without consequences for those responsible. For the families, truth mattered enormously even in the absence of legal justice. Standing by the lake again after decades of staying away because it was too painful to visit, decades during which they had last believed answers might actually surface from those waters, they listened as investigators explained carefully what had been found and what it suggested about that night in 1986. There were tears that had been held back for years finally released. There was anger that had been building quietly for decades suddenly given voice and target. There was relief twisted tightly together with renewed grief, the relief of finally knowing combined with the fresh pain of understanding exactly what had been stolen from them. Knowing did not erase the loss or restore what had been taken. It could not give them back 22 years of not knowing, could not undo the damage that uncertainty had caused. But it reshaped their grief from something formless and ongoing into something specific and finite. It gave them the ability to finally understand what had happened to the people they loved. The dock, once seen as just an ordinary structure in a familiar landscape, now carried a weight that no one in the community could ignore or dismiss. It had not simply witnessed the end of 3 young lives in a tragic accident. It had actively participated in hiding them. It had been modified and reinforced to conceal what natural processes would eventually have revealed. And as forensic teams continued their painstaking work, moving slowly and carefully to preserve every possible piece of evidence, The final question that dominated investigative thinking no longer centered on whether something terrible had happened that night. Everyone now understood that something terrible had happened. The question centered on how exactly the concealment had occurred and why it had been allowed to remain hidden successfully for so long when so many people had been actively looking for answers. Because after 22 years of silence, the lake was finally speaking. And what it revealed demanded a reckoning that could no longer be avoided or postponed, even if that reckoning could not take the form of criminal prosecution and legal justice that families desperately wanted. By the time investigators began assembling a final reconstruction of events based on all available evidence, both old and newly discovered, the case no longer belonged to the immediate present or the recent past. It belonged to multiple layers of time, to decisions made in brief moments that had echoed across decades, to actions taken by individuals whose names might never be definitively known but whose choices had shaped the lives of multiple families for more than 20 years. What they were trying to understand and document was not a mystery shaped by inexplicable coincidence or supernatural forces or anything unknowable. It was a sequence of entirely human actions, each one ordinary and understandable in isolation, each one devastating in how it combined with others to create tragedy and concealment. The reconstruction began where all the evidence, both historical and recent, consistently pointed. The dock itself is not merely a passive location where something happened but an active element in what unfolded that night, and in the days and weeks that followed. Evidence strongly suggested that the teenagers had entered the water exactly as everyone had always assumed. Nothing in the newly discovered evidence indicated restraint or coercion or pursuit beforehand. Their belongings had been arranged calmly and deliberately because at that moment nothing had gone wrong yet, because they had every reason to expect they would be retrieving those items shortly. This mattered significantly for understanding the nature of what occurred. It ruled out premeditated violence. It placed the origin of the tragedy in the water itself rather than in any deliberate human action taken before entering that water. Investigators, drawing on expert consultation and extensive research into cold water drowning scenarios, believed the first critical moment came quickly and without warning. Cold shock, even in late summer water that feels merely cool rather than dangerously cold, can incapacitate swimmers without any advance warning signs. The physiological response happens faster than conscious thought. Breathing becomes difficult or impossible. Muscles cramp or fail to respond to mental commands. Orientation is lost almost instantly. Michael, being 17 and likely the strongest swimmer of the three based on what was known about him, may have realized something was wrong first, may have recognized that he was in trouble before the others fully understood the danger. Beth and Tess would have followed instinctively, trying to help, driven by panic and friendship to reach Michael without understanding or considering how fast exhaustion spreads in open water at night when visibility is minimal and every action requires enormous physical effort. What followed was not prolonged chaos or extended struggle that should have drawn attention or left extensive evidence. It was panic compressed into seconds or at most minutes, the kind of rapid escalation that drowning victims and rescue professionals both understand can happen but that observers and even participants don't fully comprehend until too late. In water rescue attempts by untrained people, drowning victims instinctively grab downward at anything they can reach, pulling rescuers under them rather than being pulled up. They cling desperately to anyone who comes close, using that person's body to try to keep their own head above water without any conscious awareness that they're preventing both people from staying afloat. They pull each other under without meaning to, without wanting to, simply because instinct and panic override rational thought and coordinated action. One person submerging becomes two people in distress. Two people in trouble becomes three people drowning simultaneously. In complete darkness, with no lights, no reference points, no ability to see the dock or the shore or each other clearly, orientation disappears completely. Up and down become confused. The surface becomes impossible to locate. Breath runs out faster than conscious thought can process what's happening. The water, appearing calm and gentle at the surface, becomes completely unforgiving below it where movement is restricted and breathing is impossible and help is too far away. This is where the reconstruction diverged most dramatically from every assumption that had guided thinking in 1986 and for years afterward. Investigators now believed, based on where evidence had been found and how it had been positioned, that the teenagers did not drift away from the dock into open water. They did not scatter in different directions carried by currents. They did not surface and float elsewhere beyond the search area. They sank together or nearly together, close to the dock structure itself, in an area that was partially obscured by the dock's positioning and underwater supports, in a narrow space where early dive patterns had not lingered long enough and where sonar technology from that era could not penetrate with sufficient clarity to detect human remains among natural debris and structural elements. But sinking alone, even sinking in a location that was difficult to search thoroughly, did not fully explain 22 years of complete absence. Bodies submerged in water, even in concealed locations, typically surface eventually or show some evidence of their presence. The key factor, the element that explained everything else, was what happened in the hours or days following the drowning itself. Sometime after the teenagers entered the water and drowned, someone returned to the dock. Not to search. Not to call for help. Not to report what had happened or to assist with recovery efforts. But to act in ways that concealed what had occurred. Whether that person was driven by fear of being blamed, by misguided self-preservation instinct, by desire to protect someone else, or by loyalty that overrode legal and moral obligations, the decision to conceal rather than reveal became the final and most consequential turning point in the entire case. Evidence strongly suggested, though could not definitively prove beyond all possible doubt, that individuals with access to the dock and knowledge of its construction had carried out modifications under the cover and guise of routine repair work. Weight was added to the structure in specific locations. Structural elements were reinforced not randomly but strategically, precisely where additional support would be needed. The work was done carefully enough to appear legitimate, documented minimally in ways that wouldn't draw particular scrutiny, completed over a period of time that allowed it to blend into the background of normal maintenance activities. The concealment was not sophisticated in a criminal mastermind sense, did not rely on elaborate planning or complex deception. It relied instead on much simpler and more reliable factors. It relied on assumptions about how drowning cases typically resolve themselves. It relied on the expectation that water naturally returns bodies within predictable timeframes. It relied on trust that authorities would eventually find what they were looking for through persistence and proper technique. It relied most of all on time to gradually erase urgency, to shift the case from active emergency to cold mystery, to allow attention to move elsewhere while the truth stayed hidden beneath a structure that everyone could see but no one thought to thoroughly examine. That belief, that series of assumptions, worked effectively for 22 years. In 1986, professional divers had searched the lake water methodically and thoroughly using protocols that were appropriate and effective for open water recovery. They had not searched the underside of a dock structure that appeared solid and intact and normal because there was no protocol suggesting they should, no reason to suspect that a visible structure might contain or conceal evidence. Sonar technology available at that time lacked the resolution to distinguish between structural elements, natural debris, and human remains in the complex environment beneath the dock where all those elements existed in close proximity. Dive protocols developed for open water recovery focused on areas away from structures rather than the spaces within and beneath those structures where visibility was worse and movement was more restricted. The dock, visible and accessible and apparently unchanged, blended completely into normalcy. It was just part of the landscape, just the structure that had always been there, just the place where the teenagers were last seen before entering the water. Repairs made in the months and years following the disappearance only reinforced that perception of normalcy, that assumption that the dock was what it appeared to be and nothing more. The bodies remained unrecoverable not because they had been lost in any mysterious sense, not because of unusual water conditions or unprecedented circumstances, but because they were deliberately hidden in the one location that no one thought to systematically examine as a potential concealment site. They were there all along, beneath the feet of searchers who stood on the dock coordinating dive operations, beneath the structure that families visited hoping for answers, beneath the planks that continued to be used by community members who had no idea what lay below. When investigators finally reviewed repair timelines and ownership records and maintenance logs with the knowledge of what had been found beneath the dock, they discovered something deeply frustrating for anyone hoping for clear accountability. There was no single person they could definitively identify and hold responsible. Too many years had passed. Too many records were incomplete or missing entirely. Some individuals who had been involved in dock maintenance during the relevant period had died from natural causes in the intervening decades. Others, when interviewed, claimed they remembered nothing specific about particular jobs performed 20 years earlier among countless similar projects, or insisted they had performed only routine maintenance work with no knowledge of anything suspicious or unusual. Even if investigative work could establish that specific individuals had known about the concealment, even if it could be proven that they had participated actively or remained silent deliberately, proving intent beyond reasonable doubt after so much time was essentially impossible. Physical evidence had degraded. Memories had faded or become unreliable. Documentation was insufficient. And critically, statutes of limitations had expired on most charges that might have been applicable. Tampering with evidence, concealment, obstruction charges all had time limits after which prosecution became legally impossible regardless of what evidence existed. Accountability in any legal sense had evaporated over the course of 22 years. Justice through the criminal system was no longer available as an option. The families would never see anyone arrested. There would be no trial where evidence was presented and examined. There would be no conviction that provided official acknowledgement of wrongdoing. No sentence would be imposed on anyone for the choices that had kept their children hidden for decades. This was perhaps the hardest truth for the families to accept and process. Not that their children had died, that possibility had existed in their minds for years, had been something they tried to prepare themselves for even while hoping against it. But that the truth about what happened had been deliberately concealed, had been kept from them through human choice rather than natural circumstance, and that the people responsible for that concealment would face no legal consequences, would never be held officially accountable, would never have to answer in court for what they had done. The injustice of that reality was almost unbearable. For investigators who had worked on the case either initially or during the recent reassessment, the resolution brought its own kind of weight. They now understood completely why the case had resisted every logical explanation for so many years. They knew why every theory had failed to account for all the evidence. They knew why the lake had never behaved the way water was supposed to behave in drowning cases. The answers had not actually been missing in any absolute sense. They had been miscategorized, misunderstood, hidden beneath assumptions about what was normal and what required scrutiny. The dock had never been neutral in their investigation. It had been the central element all along, but no one had recognized that fact until technology advanced enough to reveal what human planning had concealed. When families were finally presented with the complete findings, with all the evidence laid out and explained as clearly as possible, there were no dramatic moments of the kind portrayed in movies or television. There was no sense of victory or satisfaction. There was only quiet reckoning, the kind that settled slowly into consciousness and reshaped grief rather than ending it. Some parents felt relief at finally having concrete information, at being able to understand what had happened instead of imagining endless terrible possibilities. Others felt anger sharpen into something colder and more focused, directed now at specific actions and decisions rather than at abstract fate or random chance. All of them felt the profound exhaustion that came from carrying unanswered questions through most of their adult lives, from wondering every single day for decades what had happened to their children. Knowing what happened did not restore what had been taken from them. 22 years could not be returned. The lives Michael and Beth and Tess should have lived could not be recovered. Grandchildren who should have existed would never be born. Careers and marriages and experiences that should have filled those years were gone permanently. But knowing did give shape and specificity to the loss. It transformed abstract absence into concrete understanding. Michael Alen was no longer an eternal question mark, no longer suspended in uncertainty. He had a complete story now with a beginning and a middle and an end, tragic but real and knowable. Beth Renfro was no longer the subject of rumors and speculation, no longer defined by mystery. She had a definite history that could be told and understood and remembered accurately. Tess Jenson was no longer frozen in uncertainty, no longer suspended between possibilities. She had a narrative that explained what had happened to her even if it couldn't change what had happened. They had a story now, a real one, grounded in physical evidence and forensic analysis and cause and consequence. It wasn't the story anyone wanted. It wasn't a story with justice or accountability or closure in any satisfying sense. But it was true, and after 22 years of not knowing, truth mattered enormously even when it came without everything else the families desperately wanted. The lake remains where it has always been, unchanged by human revelation of what it held. The dock still stands above the water, though it has been altered again in recent years. This time the alterations were done openly and thoroughly documented, carried out by investigators and forensic specialists rather than by individuals working alone or in secret. The underside of the structure is no longer hidden from official record. Every element has been photographed and catalogued and preserved as evidence, even though that evidence will never be used in criminal prosecution. People still visit the lake regularly. They still walk out onto the dock during summer months. They still fish from its weathered planks. They still sit quietly at night watching reflections on the water's surface. Some do so without any knowledge of the history associated with that place. Others come specifically because of that history, drawn by the story, wanting to see the location for themselves, trying to understand how something so tragic could have remained hidden for so long in such an ordinary-seeming place. But the place itself has changed in ways that go beyond physical alterations to the dock structure. What once felt completely ordinary now carries memory and knowledge. The ordinariness was itself partly illusion, partly the result of assumptions and incomplete information. The change is not because something supernatural or inexplicable lingers there in any mystical sense. The change is because something fundamentally human remains in memory and in understanding. The knowledge that silence can be constructed deliberately. That absence can be engineered through specific actions rather than resulting only from accident. That truth does not always rise naturally to the surface on its own without effort and investigation and eventually technological capability to see what earlier tools could not reveal. Justice in any legal sense never came to this case. No one was arrested for their role in concealing evidence. No trial took place where facts were presented and examined and judged. No conviction provided official acknowledgement that crimes had been committed beyond the original tragedy. No sentence was imposed on anyone for decisions that kept 3 families in anguished uncertainty for more than 2 decades. The law had moved on long before evidence finally caught up with truth. Statutes had expired. Witnesses had aged beyond reliable testimony. Records were too incomplete to support prosecution even if charges had been legally possible. But answers did finally arrive. And for the families who had waited most of their adult lives, for the investigators who had never stopped thinking about the 3 teenagers who vanished, for the community that had carried this mystery for a generation, answers mattered tremendously even in the absence of legal justice. Understanding mattered. Truth mattered. Being able to finally know what happened instead of endlessly wondering mattered more than anyone who hasn't experienced that kind of uncertainty could easily comprehend. Because for 22 years, the story of Michael Alen and Beth Renfro and Tess Jenson, 3 teenagers who never returned from what should have been an ordinary summer night swim, had been framed by everyone including investigators as an unsolvable mystery. Something unknowable in any definite sense. Something that belonged to chance or fate or circumstances too complex to ever fully understand. An absence so complete it seemed to defy explanation. In the end, the truth revealed through advanced technology and renewed investigation proved it wasn't chance at all. It wasn't fate or supernatural mystery or inexplicable circumstance. It was cold shock and panic in dark water, 3 young people trying to save each other and failing in the span of moments. It was human physiology and the unforgiving physics of drowning. And then it was human choice in the hours and days that followed, decisions made in fear or self-preservation or misguided loyalty. It was silence maintained deliberately. It was concealment protected by time and by assumptions about what needed to be examined. It was the belief that no one would ever look closely enough at a structure that appeared normal and intact and ordinary. They were hidden in plain sight beneath the dock that thousands of people walked across. And now, finally, after 22 years of being classified as missing, they are no longer lost. Their families can finally lay them to rest. Their story can finally be told completely. Their memory can finally exist in concrete form rather than in endless painful uncertainty. This is 72-Hour True Crime. If this case has affected you, if you're thinking about all the other families out there still waiting for answers about their missing loved ones, still living in that terrible uncertainty that Michael and Beth and Tess's families endured for more than 2 decades, then I'm asking you to do something right now. Hit that like button to help this story reach more people. Comment below with your thoughts about how this case was hidden for so long, and what it means that technology finally revealed truth that human silence had concealed. And subscribe to this channel, because we're committed to covering the cases that don't resolve in 72 hours, the ones that take years or decades to solve, the ones where families never stop waiting for truth. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story that matters. Because every case deserves to be told. Every victim deserves to be remembered. And every family deserves answers even when those answers take a generation to finally emerge. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next investigation.